All right, let's get started. So for the next 4 weeks, we are going to be talking about Martin Luther, my favorite reformer. I love Martin Luther, and we're going to be doing a little bit of historical theology, and we're going to be tracing the development of Martin Luther's theological breakthrough and its significance in the context of historical theology. So we're going to ask the question, what was Martin Luther's theological breakthrough, and why was it necessary? By the eve of the Reformation, a lot of things about the church needed to be reformed. There were things that Erasmus pointed out that were moral, ecclesiastical, theological, and a lot of different people picked up on these things that needed to be reformed. For Luther, the church primarily needed theological reform. So Luther saw in his day a pervasive Pelagianism in the soteriology of the church. And this was what the Reformation was all about. There was, because of this, and because of other things like indulgences, and we'll talk about that a little bit too, there was a crisis of assurance in late medieval theology. There were people like Gasparo Contarini, and we'll hear about him in a couple of weeks, who didn't know how he needed to be justified, like the rich young ruler. And there was a crisis about that. So that's my goal. We're going to explain Martin Luther's theological breakthrough, but we're going to start all the way back in about 400 AD with Augustine of Hippo. But before we talk about Augustine, let me talk a little bit about historical theology. We are going to be embarking together on a mode of inquiry, which is, I've found, uncommon in the church, in this church in particular. I think this is a little bit different branch of theology than what Parkwoods is used to, at least normally. Now, theology can be broken down into several distinct sub-disciplines. You have biblical studies, systematic theology, philosophical theology, there is pastoral theology, there's church history, and then there's historical theology. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. Historical theology basically combines elements of church history and elements of systematic theology to show how we got the doctrines that we have today. So, I would say at Parkwoods, most of the things that we focus on are biblical studies and church history. But historical theology is, according to Alistair McGrath, the branch of theological inquiry which aims to explore the historical development of Christian doctrines and identify the factors which were influential in their formation. So historical theology, it's going to be a little bit different than you're used to maybe. We're not going to do exegesis, although we might touch on that. We're not going to primarily focus on church history, although that's going to be an important part too. We're going to focus basically on the history of ideas. Augustine had ideas. Martin Luther had theological ideas. And there's a continuity between Augustine and Martin Luther. And that's the big picture thing that we're going to focus on in these 4 weeks. There is a continuity between the church fathers, and in particular Augustine, and the ideas of the Reformation. And there are discontinuities, and we'll talk about both. And then we'll talk about the development of Augustine's ideas in light of the late medieval theology. So, I do want to focus on Augustine today. But I just wanted to tell you that because I want to encourage you to hang with me, because this is all going to make sense. Everything I tell you is strategic so that when we get to Martin Luther, you will see, oh, That idea has significance for this reason. This idea has significance for this reason, going back to Augustine. This idea is similar to Augustine, but different from the late medieval theologians. But today, I do want to focus on Augustine. And I'm planning actually to spend 2 weeks on Augustine. Today we're going to get through the Pelagian Controversy, and we're just going to get through what is Pelagianism. And then next week we'll focus on Augustine's theology of grace and his theology of sin, and we'll get all the way through 529, which is when the Second Council of Orange cemented Augustine's ideas. Okay. So I'm going to say a little bit about Augustine's life, but before we get to that, I want to highlight Augustine's importance in church history. Augustine is the most important non-biblical thinker in the history of Christianity, I think without question. Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, maybe Anselm, and maybe Calvin. Maybe you throw in Edwards at number 6. But Augustine's number 1, without question. And it's astonishing how much Augustine accomplished in his life. He lived until he was 75, and he wrote over 5 million words that still survive. I was listening to a lecture by John Piper on Augustine, and he said that somebody told him one time that don't trust anybody who claims that they have read all of Augustine, because he's a liar. Nobody has read all of Augustine. Augustine dealt with 3 major doctrinal controversies. He dealt with the Manichaean controversy. He dealt with the Donatist controversy, which had to do with the doctrine of the church and the sacraments. And then he also dealt with the Pelagian controversy, which is what we're going to be focusing on today and next week. His writings were formative in the church's understanding of sin, salvation, ecclesiology, the sacraments, and the Trinity. About the only thing that Augustine didn't focus on was Christology. And I thought of a fun analogy of Augustine's importance from baseball. Okay, so I went to baseballreference.com and I looked up their list of the most valuable players of all time in terms of a statistic called WAR, which measures how good a player is in reference to a hypothetical replacement level player. That doesn't matter. Let's take George Brett as an example. George Brett is one of the 50 greatest players ever to play baseball. Okay? His WAR over 21 seasons was 88.4. And he's like number 47. Babe Ruth's WAR is 183.6. And Babe Ruth also played 22 seasons. Barry Bonds' WAR is in 22 seasons is 162.4. Barry Bonds was a Hall of Fame player before he even went to the San Francisco Giants. So George Brett, who's one of the top 50 players of all time, in roughly the same number of seasons, Babe Ruth was over twice as valuable as George Brett. George Brett would have had to play until he was 60 at the same level he played for the first 20 years just to begin to match the career of Babe Ruth. That's how dominant Babe Ruth was. He's the greatest player ever to live, and Augustine is Babe Ruth. There is no one like him in the history of the church. When the Pelagian Controversy started in about 410, Augustine was already 56 years old. Now, Jeff, you're 56, right?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know that would be sensitive.
Thanks for reminding me.
Sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't think about that. Okay. Augustine lived until he was 75 years old. So when he was Jeff's age, he still, over the next 10 years, tackled a major controversy in the history of the church that still informs the whole discussion that we have today. Augustine shaped the church, the direction of the church, to this very day on all of the issues that he talked about. There's a famous quote that basically all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. Well, you could say the same thing about Augustine. All of Western church history and historical theology is, in one way or another, a commentary on Augustine. In fact, Jerome called him the second founder of the Christian faith. And that was back then. Now, the funny thing is, and I just want to bring this up because this is so interesting to me. The funny thing is that for how influential Augustine was, his thought basically gave legitimacy to two completely different camps. B.B. Warfield had an interesting quote in his treatment of Augustine, and he says this: "The Reformation, inwardly considered, was just the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over Augustine's doctrine of the church." Let me say that again. I think that's a really important sentence for understanding church history. The Reformation, inwardly considered, was just the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over Augustine's doctrine of the church. So we love Augustine, we Protestants. And the Catholics, they love Augustine for completely different reasons. Out of his mind and out of his pen came the legitimacy for both the modern Catholic Church and the modern Protestant movement. And this is what the Reformation was. The Reformation was basically, on some level, a fight over whose side the church fathers were on. Augustine was, I think, the most quoted church father. Everybody wanted Augustine to be on their side, because if you were on Augustine's side, then you were right and the other guys were wrong. In fact, I went back to, and we're going to revisit Luther later, but I went back to Luther's Heidelberg Disputation, a very important document that he wrote in, I think, 1518. And here's what he says before he crafts these theses that he did for debate. He says, "Distrusting completely our own wisdom, according to that counsel of the Holy Spirit, do not rely on your own insight. We humbly present to the judgment of all those who wish to be here on these theological paradoxes, so that it may become clear whether they have been deduced well or poorly from St. Paul, the especially chosen vessel and instrument of Christ, and also from St. Augustine, his most trustworthy interpreter." So Luther's criticism of the medieval theology had a lot to do with the fact that he didn't think they were in line with Augustine's views of the doctrine of salvation. All right, so that's Augustine's importance. And, feel free to ask any questions. If you have any questions so far, feel free to ask. All right, let's do a short introduction to Augustine's life. We'll do a little bit of church history here because we can't do historical theology without a little bit of church history. So Augustine lived from 354 to 430. He was born in Tagaste, I'm not sure exactly how you say that, in North Africa, which is modern-day Algeria. He received a classical education and was, of course, a brilliant student. At 17, he went to Carthage to study rhetoric. Now, Augustine was a pagan until he was 31. In all his life, the thing that really held him back was lust. When he was 19, he took up a concubine, which he lived with for, I think, 10 years. But in 385, after he had gone to Milan, he came under the influence of Ambrose, a very famous in his day preacher and bishop of Milan. And then in the summer of 386, after he had been sitting under Ambrose's teaching for a while, he had a very famous conversion experience. Now, if you've ever read, I really recommend, Jeff recommended that you guys read Pilgrim's Progress. You need to read Confessions. I would say Confessions is one of the staples, one of the fundamentals of Christian literature. And he describes his conversion in the Confessions. He says that he was sitting in a garden in Milan, and he heard voices that sounded like children's voices. And they were saying, "Tolle lege," which means, "take and read." And so he did what any modern-day evangelical would do. He grabbed his Bible, he opened it up at random, and he looked at the first verse that his eye fell upon. And that happened to be a verse from Romans 13 that talked about lust. And so from that moment, Augustine was converted, firmly a follower of Jesus Christ. And in 391, he was ordained a priest. And in 395, he became the bishop of Hippo Regius. That's another city in North Africa and modern-day Algeria. And as I mentioned before, Augustine, throughout his career as a bishop and theologian, he battled three major heresies. He battled Manichaeism, Donatism, and Pelagianism. And obviously the one that we're going to focus on today is Pelagianism. Okay, so let me give you a brief overview of the Pelagian Controversy. Like I said, Augustine was 56 when he started to take up writing against the Pelagians. And in his writings, which are voluminous, I bought two big volumes. Actually, there's one big one and one medium-sized one. But there are two other big volumes that I could have bought that contain all of his anti-Pelagian writings. And he did this over about 10 years. You could say 410 to 420, or maybe a little bit more exactly, 411 to 418, when there was the Council of Carthage. And in the anti-Pelagian writings, Augustine is responding to the teachings of three men. There are three main proponents of the Pelagian view, not just Pelagius himself. The first one is Rufinus the Syrian, and he's probably the least known, but actually he was probably the real founder of Pelagianism. He was a priest from Palestine, and he came to Italy in 399 and was active in Rome. And in Rome, Rufinus met and influenced both Pelagius and Celestius. So Celestius was number two. Celestius was a lawyer of noble birth, and he became a disciple of Pelagius around 390, and he was also influenced, like I just said, by Rufinus. He tried to be ordained a priest in 411, but he ended up being brought up on charges of heresy by this guy named Paulinus of Milan. And he was condemned at a gathering of bishops at Carthage in 411. Now this is confusing because there are like 3 councils of Carthage. There's like the main one in 418, and then there are 2 others. So another council of Carthage, along with another totally separate council, also condemned him in 416. And then in 417, the Pope condemned him, but after that Pope died, the next Pope, Pope Zosimus, he reversed the condemnation. But after pressure from bishops of Africa, who were no doubt influenced by Augustine, Zosimus reversed the reversal in March 418 so that Celestius was condemned again. So he got condemned, and then that pope died, then he got uncondemned, and he got condemned again. And then in April 418, because there was some rioting in Rome, the emperor of Rome, Emperor Honorius, actually condemned Pelagius and Celestius and banned them both from Rome. And then Celestius' teachings, along with those of Pelagius, were then finally condemned at the last council of Carthage. That's the big council of Carthage in May 418. And we'll say more about that next week. Now, then there was obviously Pelagius. Pelagius was a British monk and a theologian who was active in Rome during about 390 to 410. Pelagius, now let's not, one goal today is to be a little bit sympathetic to Pelagius. And let's not just use him as a punching bag, although we'll kind of do that. Pelagius was, first and foremost, a moral reformer. And Pelagius' great concern was Christian obedience. Now, in 415, a complaint was brought against him by this guy named Orosius, who was a Spanish priest and a disciple of Augustine. This resulted in this other council. There are all these councils. Don't worry, there's not going to be a test. This resulted in this other council called the Council of Diospolis in 415. And Pelagius, I believe, actually testified at this council. And the council actually found that Pelagius was orthodox. But Augustine believed, and he makes much of this in his anti-Pelagian writings, Augustine always believed that Pelagius deliberately misrepresented his position when he testified at this council. And as we'll see, it kind of made me think of, if you're familiar with this, the trial of Peter Leithart or the Federal Vision. One of the things about Pelagius is he uses familiar terms, but he redefines them. And so he's a little bit slippery. He's a little bit hard to nail down, and I think that's probably why he was acquitted at that trial. But never fear, in 418, at the last Council of Carthage, Pelagius and his views were finally condemned. Okay, so that's a brief history, a little bit complicated. A lot happened in those years, 411 to 418. But those are some of the main highlights about who was involved and sort of how it all unfolded. Now, interestingly, Augustine and Pelagius never actually met, although they did correspond a few times, and they may have even seen each other, because Pelagius did come to Hippo, where Augustine was a bishop, but they never actually, so far as I know, sat down and talked. All right, so we're about to move on to what is Pelagianism. Are there any questions so far, or comments? Hopes, fears, dreams? All right. And just raise your hand at any time. Okay. So, before we go into the specific tenets of Pelagianism, I want to try to be somewhat sympathetic to Pelagius by introducing his theology from a broad perspective. One of the ways that you can understand Pelagius' theology is that it is what you would call a pastoral or a moral theology. In other words, so you might call Augustine's theology a confessional theology. Like if you read Augustine's Confessions, he's all about looking back on his life and reflecting on how God was providentially there to draw him to himself. Even things like Augustine talks about when he was 19 years old, he read this work by Cicero called the Hortensius. And Augustine says that was one of the things that moved him along the pathway to conversion, because after he read the Hortensius, he became much more adamant and much more firm in his willingness to seek truth. He became much more concerned to seek truth. And so even though he wasn't converted then, it was nevertheless a key milestone along the way. But for Pelagius looked at the sort of the whole thing from the opposite perspective. You could call Augustine's theology a God-centered theology. Pelagius' theology was a man-centered theology, and in this instance, I really mean that in the best possible way. Pelagius started off by addressing people where they were today. And as I've said before, his greatest concern was with Christian obedience. Pelagius was concerned that Christians must take seriously the call to obey God. And when he heard Augustine's doctrine of grace, or that man was dependent on grace in any way, that in his mind, that compromised man's ability to obey God. It compromised his incentive to obey God. If everything's by grace, why should we be obedient? Now, of course, you might be thinking certain scripture passages in your head, but this was how Pelagius thought. He thought too many people in his day had become morally lax. Too many people didn't take the call to obey Christ seriously. And so that's why part of the reason why he developed the theology that he did. Now, Pelagius had a famous reaction against a prayer of Augustine in his Confessions. In Book 10 of Augustine's Confessions, Augustine says this. He's praying to God, and he says, "Command what you will, and grant what you command." Command what you will, and grant what you command. Pelagius hated that. He heard in that prayer exactly the kind of theology that undercut the Christian's moral obedience that he so much hated. And in fact, he heard that quoted in a sermon, and he almost got in a fist fight with the bishop who quoted it. In his letter to a woman named Demetrius, Pelagius expresses concern that humans must be able to do what God commands them to do. If God commands what humans are unable to do, then first of all, God is unjust and cruel. You know, what kind of person would command that a little 2-year-old go out and get a job and help pay the rent. For Pelagius, that's what Augustine was saying. God has all of these commands, but humans have no natural ability to obey them. And secondly, it would undercut human responsibility. If I tell a 2-year-old to go out and get a job and to help pay the rent, and he doesn't do it, and then I punish him because he didn't go out to get a job and pay the rent, that doesn't seem fair. He's 2. That's what Pelagius heard when he heard that prayer. So, in response to statements like that, views like that, Pelagius developed a doctrine of original sin and a doctrine of human free will and a doctrine of grace that was radically different than the kind of thinking that Augustine was doing. So let me summarize the teachings of Pelagius in 3 main points. First, Pelagius denied original sin. Pelagius denied original sin. For Augustine, and obviously for us, spoiler alert, who won, the doctrine of original sin says this. Now, some people think that original sin refers to Adam's sin. That's not the case. Original sin refers to the idea that because of Adam's sin, we are sinful too. That there's some kind of connection, and there are different ways to put it. There's some kind of connection between Adam, our first father, and all of humanity, such that when Adam sinned in the garden, when he ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, all of humanity was affected because of that. But Pelagius says, that's not right. Rather, instead of this corrupt nature being passed down from Adam, the reason that humans sin, and Pelagius doesn't deny that humans are sinful. He doesn't even deny that everybody who's ever lived has sinned. What he denies is that the reason they sin is because they have this mystical connection with Adam. So for Pelagius, human sin comes not because of a sinful nature. Human sin comes, first of all, by imitating Adam. And second, human sin comes only through deliberate actions. In other words, we're sinful because we sin. We don't sin because we're sinful. And here's a quote from Pelagius. He says this: "Everything good or evil for which we deserve either praise or blame is not something with which we are born. We're not born with it, but it's something we do. For we are born capable of each of them, but not filled with either of them. And as we are begotten without virtue, so we are begotten without vice. And before the act of our own will, there is in a human being only what God created." So in other words, when a baby is born, and a lot of this controversy, by the way, had to do with whether or not we should baptize babies, because do they have original sin or not? When a baby is born, I guess Pelagius would say it's basically a blank slate. He's not virtuous, he's not vicious, he's not sinful, he's not morally good, he's sort of morally neutral. Basically the same as Adam was in the garden. Now, number 2. Pelagius argued because of this, because he denied original sin, Pelagius argued that the human will after the fall is completely free to choose between good and evil. The human will after the fall is completely free to choose between good and evil. Because human nature was not harmed by the fall of Adam, man after the fall, as we just said, has no disposition toward either good or evil. There is no moral difference between man after the fall and man before the fall. The fall didn't do any injury to human nature. It didn't corrupt it, it didn't distort it, it didn't twist it. And therefore, human beings after the fall have what theologians call libertarian free will. Now let me explain that. Let me use 2 illustrations. So, think about making a decision. Augustine and we would say that whenever you make a decision, you make that decision with a predisposition based on what your preferences are. So in other words, say you go into an ice cream shop, okay? And say, I don't know what ice cream shop this is, but they only offer 3 flavors. They offer chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry, okay? And you love chocolate ice cream because you love chocolate, but you hate vanilla ice cream and you hate strawberry ice cream. And so when you go into the ice cream store, what flavor do you order?
Chocolate.
You get the chocolate. Yes. Very good. You get the chocolate because, and you chose it freely, right? You wanted to choose the chocolate. But the reason you chose it was because you like chocolate, not because you're some sort of independent, autonomous moral agent. Let me use one more illustration here. Libertarian free will says that the human will is like a balance scale. So picture a balance scale. And for Augustine, so the balance scale is weighing your desires. And for Augustine, we still have the scale, and we'll say more about that next week. For Augustine, the scale is there, but it's weighted down on one side towards sin. And because it's weighted towards sin, therefore we want to sin, and therefore that's what we choose. And we choose it freely, but nevertheless the scale is weighted. For Pelagius, the scale has no weights. So whenever you go to make a decision, you're completely free. It's almost like randomness. To me, it doesn't really make sense philosophically, but this is how Pelagius thinks. There's no weight in the scale, so you're free to do whatever you want. If you come to a fork in the road, you have no inclination whether to take the left path or the right path, and so you do whatever. You're an independent moral agent. I hope that makes sense. Now, this has a lot of implications. One of them is this, and this is something that gets debated in the Pelagian writings of Augustine. This means that for Pelagius, it's possible that somebody after the fall could live a sinless life. Because the human nature wasn't injured by sin, and because humans have libertarian free will, they may choose the right path every time. They may never stumble. Now, so for Pelagius, it's important to say that that's at least theoretically possible. And in fact, Pelagius thought that some Old Testament figures had been sinless, like I think Noah and some others. All right. Are any questions about that? Because that's important, really. That idea of the scale, that's going to be so important, both for understanding, I think, the biblical view and for understanding Augustine and then Pelagius. All right. Number 3 out of 3. So Pelagius denied original sin. He argued that human free will after the fall is completely free to choose between good and evil. And number 3, Pelagius redefined grace. This is important. Pelagius redefined grace. This is why I said he testified at that council and then they acquitted him. I think this was partly the reason why. If you ask Pelagius, do we need God's grace in order to be saved? He says yes. The key, though, is that for Pelagius, grace means something very different than it did for Augustine and than it does for us. So for Pelagius, grace means 2 things. First, grace is, now we're Reformed. This may not even make sense in your mind when I say it at first. First, for Pelagius, grace is the natural human faculties. Grace is the natural human faculties. That doesn't even make sense to us because we think of grace being out there, right? We can't do it. We need help, and so God helps us. He's out there, we're here, he helps, he sends his grace, and he helps us. For Pelagius, that wasn't what grace was at all. For Pelagius, man has the natural ability to obey God's commands. And this is grace because God created man with that ability. Let me say it again. Man has the natural ability to obey God's commands. And this is grace because God created man with that ability. So for Pelagius, grace is nature. For Pelagius, grace is the fact that we were created able to obey. So one way you can think of it is that Pelagius takes grace, which we usually think happens over here, and he says, no, actually the grace doesn't happen over here. It doesn't happen when you're a sinner and you need God's help. Actually, it happens here, when you're created. For Augustine, it was important to see grace both in creation and in redemption. But for Pelagius, grace was only a creation category. For Pelagius, creation was grace. Nature is grace. And that's important because we'll see this kind of thinking about grace again later when we talk about the late medieval theology. Now let me just prove to you that I'm not making this up. Here's a quotation from Pelagius from his Nature. Now all of these quotations from Pelagius, they come from the writings of Augustine, so that's just a disclosure. Pelagius says, "The ability not to sin lies not so much in the power of choice as in the necessity of nature. Whatever lies in the necessity of nature undoubtedly pertains to the author of nature, namely God. How then can one suppose that what is shown to pertain to God as his very own is said to exist apart from God's grace?" In other words, that's a fancy way of saying, because God created us able to obey him, God's creating us, that was his grace. That was where his grace is located. When he created us with that nature, that's what the gracious act was. And because he did it here, he doesn't have to do it here. Secondly, for Pelagius, and this finally, for Pelagius, grace is external enlightenment provided for humanity by God. So, this is even worse. For Pelagius, grace is the law, or the law is grace. And again, this is something that doesn't even make sense to us if we read the Apostle Paul and we're aware of the Reformed tradition at all. The law is grace? That's like saying married bachelor. Listen to how Augustine says it. He, Pelagius, locates the grace and help of God, which helps us not to sin, either in nature and in free choice, or in the law and teaching. Thus, when God helps one to turn away from evil and do good, Pelagius thinks that God helps by revealing and showing us what to do, but not by cooperating with us and pouring love into us so that we do what we know we should do. So in other words, when God provides us moral guidance, like through the Ten Commandments, that's grace for Pelagius. So, yeah, Pelagius can say, do we need grace to be saved? Yes. But Pelagius has so redefined grace that it's almost totally meaningless. And that's Pelagianism. So I'm done for today. I have time for maybe one question? All right, very good. Let's prepare for worship.